Hello everyone, welcome to this time of sermon preparation, and this week we're preparing for the 28th Sunday of Ordinary Time in Cycle A. This time of preparation helps us to hear what God is saying to us and to also hear the challenge of the gospel. If we look at the readings for this Sunday, we should hear a challenge. Yes, we'll hear about the joy of the kingdom and how generous and wonderful God is, but we will also, I hope, hear the challenge. I remember reading somewhere one time that if we don't hear the challenge of God's word, then we haven't properly listened. And I suppose in the light of Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, the challenge is very clear for us. We are to work to change our world, to serve, to uplift those who are in need, serve to heal divisions and anger and frustration. And as we begin in this parish, our third week of stewardship that looks at service, the challenge to be servants of the kingdom, servants of the banquet, I think come out clearly in our liturgy for this Sunday. So let's have a look at the readings for this 28th Sunday of the year. The first reading is taken from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 25, verses 6 to 10. The responsorial psalm is the famous and lovely Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. The second reading is a conclusion now to St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. We've been reading that for a number of weeks now, and this extract concludes that letter. Chapter 4, verses 12 to 14, and then verses 19 to 20. The Gospel is taken from St. Matthew, chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. Obviously, you will see that there is a clear link between the first reading and the Gospel again. Both speak about banquets. If we look at the Gospel, it would appear that there are two sections to our Gospel, and we might even be tempted to think that the second section, the last part of our Gospel extract, almost contradicts the first. But it doesn't really. We'll come to that. In ancient times, banquets were given by kings or generals or very, very powerful, influential people. Ordinary men and women like you and me didn't give big banquets. And the banquets were usually given after a time of war when the general or the king had been successful and had triumphed. And in both the prophet Isaiah's reading and this extract from Matthew, there is that sense. In the Gospel, it is clearly the Messianic age. God, Jesus, has triumphed. And all the promises, all the messages that had been sent by the messengers and may be rejected are now fulfilled in this wonderful wedding banquet. This Gospel of Matthew also neatly sums up, I suppose, both the tragedy and the joy of salvation history. The joy is, of course, the fulfillment of the banquet and the enjoyment of the people who come to the banquet, enjoyment of the food and the company. That's the joy of salvation history, the triumph of salvation history. The tragedy is that so many people have rejected the invitation. There's sort of three groupings of people who go out to invite. The first two groups of people who go out to invite people in represent the Old Testament prophets up to John the Baptist. the final group that go out to invite people in are the apostles and you and me. And we know, and even in our own time, we see it, that people reject, ignore, are disinterested in the invitation you and I offer to people to come and to enjoy the banquet. We see that even in our own families. The second part of the gospel is about being properly disposed. St. Matthew talks about putting on a wedding suit, a wedding garment. Remember Matthew's gospel? We've been looking at it over the last 3 weeks, these different parables, these 3 different parables about the kingdom, about participating in the life of the kingdom. Well, remember what's happening in Matthew's gospel? A mainly Jewish community. Gentiles, though, are coming in, and the number of Gentile Christians is increasing. So the Jews represent those first groups that were invited. Gentiles, those who were invited because some of the Jews had rejected the invitation. But Matthew says these newcomers, these latecomers, still must be properly dressed. Now we might think, well, that's a bit tough because they've been in the hedgerows and they weren't expecting an invitation, and so of course they haven't got the right clothes. But Matthew makes it clear that that Gentile section of his community are still to adopt the ways of Jesus. They are to put on a new garment. Baptism should transform our thinking. There is a new Christian logic that we must take on. So that's the gospel. The first reading, this chapter falls into what's called the apocalyptic section of the book of Isaiah. And these chapters are written when the people have returned from exile. Remember the exile in Babylon, Assyria? They've now returned to Jerusalem. They have triumphed. They have overcome. Yes, it's been tough. It's not been nice up there in Babylon or Assyria, wherever they were, the 2 places. But now they're back home. And all the heartache and pain can be forgotten. God has been faithful to his promise, his love, his care, and brought them back to once again care for them. And as we read that section, we see that, it's lovely, because isn't that the desire of every human heart? To live with the Lord, to have our lives transformed, for him to take away those tears and pain. And so that reading from Isaiah is truly beautiful and links very well with the gospel. The second reading concludes, as I said, St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. And it's quite a touching conclusion. Remember, Paul is thanking the Philippians for their gifts while he is in captivity in Ephesus. But as he thanks them, he also sort of says, well, even if you hadn't sent anything, I would have been okay. Sounds a bit harsh, but ungrateful. But what St. Paul is trying to get at is that Jesus is all we need. He had Jesus. He believed that Jesus was with him. And so ultimately, that's all anybody ever needs, because Jesus will help us through anything. And so a touching thanks, but also a reminder that with Jesus, everything is possible, even when we are suffering. So that's some thinking surrounding these readings. I hope you both hear the joy and the wonder of the readings, as well as the challenge. Let's be alert to the challenge of the gospel, to serve and to respond to God's word and God's mission. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Take care of yourselves and enjoy the rest of the week. God bless. Bye-bye.